Ellen Birkett Morris holds an MFA in creative writing from Queen's University, Charlotte. She teaches creative writing at the Virginia Piper Center at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, and the Carnegie Center for Literacy and Learning in Lexington, Kentucky. She joins me today on Uncorking a Story to discuss her career and latest novel, Beware the Tall Grass. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Ellen.
Hi, Mike. I'm glad to be here.
Ellen, I'm excited to have you here, and I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Oh gosh, I'm really going to have to trace this to being a small child. My father was a writer. He wrote detective Miss Private Eye mysteries set in my hometown of Louisville that got published in the 80s and 90s. But my story begins really early because he loved to read and he would read us a bunch of stuff at bedtime, including Flannery O'Connor short stories, which, really were so vivid and intense and dark and meaningful. I'm sure I didn't get the half of it, but they certainly made an impression. He was also the same guy that would take us to whatever movie he wanted to see, regardless of the rating, kind of thing. But I think that's where it started. That's where I started getting fascinated by story, and then watching him work. Watching him work as I was growing up, which I always thought I was a kid. I was watching TV, running in and out, and I thought that looks really, really boring. But there was a point at which for me was my early 30s, where I thought, I've always wanted to write. I've always been afraid to write. If I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it. And so I began really a long apprenticeship that brought me to where I am today.
So I just need to dig into your dad for a moment because I had one of those fathers too who would take me and my twin brother to any movie, regardless of the rating, as you point out. That I mean, completely inappropriate movies for like 9 and 10-year-olds. Like we were seeing any Dirty Harry movie that came out, any Clint Eastwood movie, really. And he'd always be
Right.
like, "Okay, boys, close your eyes." If there was a, let's call it a naughty scene, uh,
Right.
on the
Um,
big screen. But do you remember any of the movies that you saw when you were young that you probably shouldn't have seen?
Oh, absolutely. The prime example. And of course, I brought this up. Dad died in 2009, and I brought it up at his memorial. He brought us to see Woody Allen's Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, but were afraid to ask. So, I mean, just imprinted on my young mind was this gigantic breast toddling across a lawn. It was the absolute worst choice. He also brought us to The Long Goodbye, which of course was a detective kind of story and had all kinds of nudity and drugs and all the rest. But yeah, it was definitely along those lines. And it was like, Dad wants to go to the movies, because we're all going with him.
Yeah, I think I did my kids a disservice. Like they got to see all the Disney animated films that came out and anything by Pixar. I never took them to anything I wanted to see, but I guess secretly I did want to see some of those Pixar movies because they were pretty good.
Absolutely.
So you said a long apprenticeship. Tell me a little bit more about that. So in your, it sounds like it started in your 30s.
Yeah, yeah. I really, in terms of that, it started first with just trying to write. And, despite this fear of being a bad writer, I definitely was. I wrote a lot of bad stuff before I wrote the good stuff. So I started writing at first children's stuff, which was way too hard for me, really. It needed to be just so precise. The voice needed to be just right. So I went on and I got intrigued by poetry, wrote some poetry, got better at poetry, did some classes, did some reading, ended up with enough poems to develop a chapbook of poems, a short collection, and that gave me confidence. And then I began to start to work in the short story form, and I pursued an MFA at Queen's University, Charlotte, and by the time I got out of that program, I really had enough short stories that were cohesive enough that I had a collection. And that got published in 2020. Since then, I had put together another chapbook of poetry, and then I decided to tackle a novel, which is Beware the Tall Grass, which just came out this year. And, for me, I was so afraid to take on something as big as the novel, but I had to find workarounds and ways in. So I would say, I was writing, I was reading, I was in writers groups, I was taking classes. I would go away to summer writing programs like the Kenyon Writers Workshop in Ohio, and I was just paying a lot of attention to what was out there, um, and just working and reworking, and that probably constitutes, that apprenticeship that I mentioned.
So what were you doing before that period of time? So before your 30s, like what did you let's bring us up to that point in time.
Yeah,
What did you
yeah.
choose to do with your life before you got involved in all this craziness?
Yeah, I got a bachelor's in English, and I got a job at a company where you read newspaper articles and index them for research databases back before AI would do that for you. So it was a lot of reading. I got a master's in communications. I was really interested in broadcast, and I went to University of Cincinnati. They had advertised a broadcast program, but didn't really have one. So I ended up in a degree with a degree in interpersonal and organizational communication. Spent 10 years as an adjunct faculty teaching all around Louisville, the Louisville area. And then I knew I really wanted to write. I had did a short stint as an assistant public relations person for my local independent bookstore, which was a great way to pick up some knowledge about just the world of publishing. Started freelance writing, got on the staff of the local business newspaper, which was a great way to learn that I didn't want to write about buildings and square footage. And then then I ended up getting. I do some side work. I do freelance media relations for the Kentucky Foundation for Women, a feminist social change uh, organization. They fund feminist artists in Kentucky who are working for social change. So I help spread the word about those grantees and the work they're doing. And I also do author interviews and book reviews and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm doing on the side. But that's sort of what led me to this idea that I really wanted to pursue the writing in earnest. So I was always making some money while I was trying to foster, this dream of writing. And then at a certain point, really decided to go all in a way. I'm still doing these side jobs, but a good bit of my time is focused on my own work, which is
Yeah.
really fantastic.
Yeah. So, but everything you were doing, I mean, even from your undergraduate days, it's really adjacent to really kind of where you are now. I mean, the degree in English, communications, all of that other stuff is it's not like you were a lawyer and then decided, hey, I'm gonna, and I've interviewed plenty of those.
Yeah.
it's it was you were kind of. It sounds like maybe you knew at some point in time that this is really what you wanted to be doing.
Honestly, I knew it since I was a child, and I still have a, written out on notebook paper, bound with ribbons story that I wrote back then. And even in college, I knew that I wanted to do it, but I was really afraid of being bad at it. That definitely an example of somebody who was afraid and really had to muster my courage. And then once I got in it, really had to, continue to sort of encourage myself to keep going, knowing ultimately that I had some ideas and that I had things I wanted to say, and that I'd done the work to build my skills to get published, that sort of thing. But fear, and I think it's true of a lot of writers, fear was a huge thing for me, and I'm just glad there was a point at which I said, "Hey, I'm going to do this."
Yeah. I think fear, that's absolutely like right for so many people. And fear does hold a lot of people back. But one message that I always like to share with aspiring authors is, fear, it's okay to be bad at something when you're first trying it. It's no one is a great ice skater the first time they put on ice skates and get on the ice.
Absolutely.
No one is a master chef the first time they try and bake a pie or a loaf of bread. Like you are going to stink at it.
Right.
But you're gonna get better if that's where your passion is, and if you just try more.
Right.
It's like going to the gym. No one can bench 300 pounds the first time they go into the gym. I mean, maybe not the hundredth. I was never able to bench 300 pounds, but you know what I mean? It's like you got to, but it's something you have to work at. And writing is no different.
Exactly, exactly. And that's, that's really part of it. And that combination of working at it and believing in yourself, knowing that like, not, it may be that nobody else is going to believe in you as much as you believe in yourself. So you need to foster that. You need to own that and use it to motivate yourself to do what you want to do, with your writing. So,
So I know you want to talk about Beware the Tall Grass, and I do too. Before we get there, in my research, I found you as part of a collection of something called 35 Women Up to No Good.
oh,
Does that ring a bell?
yes, it does. Yeah.
What was that? Because the cover was provocative to me.
Yeah, the cover really was provocative. I'm trying to remember what story I had in there, but really these were stories about women being audacious. These were stories about women being brave, and it definitely had that kind of provocative feel to it. In fact, right after that came out, I went and did a book selling event at the Lexington, Kentucky Farmers Market. And I was sitting there with that book with its provocative cover, and they sat me next to a man who had self-published a children's book called Little Miss Grubby Toes, and we couldn't have been more portly matched. And people were snatching up this children's book, which you know didn't really look like my cup of tea, and they would take one look at that cover and just walk on by like that, like as if they needed to put one of those but if it needed to be wrapped in paper or something,
Right.
it was that kind of thing. But yeah, those were really stories, slightly racy stories of women's courage and audacity. And it was, and that's fun too, along the way, finding anthologies and ways to get published before you've built a body of work that's big enough to publish your own book.
Yeah, I'm curious how being part of that anthology helped you get to publication for this one, because I know one thing that aspiring authors, and I face this as well, is not having the right platform for an agent to take you on, or a publisher to kind of bring you into the fold. So was that helpful for you, being able to say, hey, I was part of an anthology?
Yeah, I mean, I really aggressively pursued publishing opportunities. And so, as a consequence of that, I've got a pretty long resume that's, I've got fiction, poetry, essays, book reviews. I have a resume that has, multiple publications on it. But that's the result of how many, 20, 25 years of concerted effort and aggressive submissions, right? And so for me, I've sort of observed early on that that was a way to build legitimacy. So write a small piece, get it published. If you're lucky enough, get it nominated for a pushcart prize if the editor liked it. But I really sought publication first among smaller, newer journals, local or regional journals, later among journals of a higher standard. When I had a piece I really believed in, I sent it to the Antioch Review, which is really well known, and it's no longer in print, but it was very prestigious at the time. A year after I sent it to them, I got a phone call from their editor saying he liked the story and he was going to publish it. So again, I was hanging in there. It was like I knew the story was good, so I was waiting to see, and it sort of developed a philosophy that it's going to be the right story with the right editor on the right day. It could be a small detail in your story that they like. It could be the premise. It could be a word choice, and so I'm going to keep sending until I find that right editor was kind of my approach to that. But yeah, absolutely. That was kind of how I built my sense of legitimacy. And then after I had short stories in journals, a couple times I had agents reach out to me. One of them actually took on this book, Beware the Tall Grass. but it turns out that he really wasn't doing his due diligence. He used my letter to him as a query letter. He didn't suggest any edits. He was kind of just throwing the book out there to see if anybody would take it, and he was forced to resign from a professional organization. And when I heard that, I thought, it's time to, not discontinue this relationship. Ultimately, I found a small press prize, the Donald L. Jordan Prize, through Columbus State University in Georgia. It's relatively new. It's pretty rare. They actually publish your book and give you $10,000. So that's real money, which is really rare in the indie press world. And it's administered by Alan G., who's a very well respected writer. And I figured, I'm going to go with that versus I didn't have the energy to go back out into the agenting world after what had happened. So turned out to be a good fit. So it's all about those kinds of choices. Some writers really want to get agented and want to get a big five publisher. Other writers say they love the freedom that you get with a small press, that you're able to have a lot of input, that sort of thing. And so they'll go totally small press. My hope is that with the next book, I'll get an agent again. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like based on everything you told me, Ellen, that you're clearly an overnight success, just like every that I've interviewed here on Uncorking a Story.
Right, right. Yeah.
Um,
Just years and years of work. So,
right, right.
yeah.
Well, let's talk about Beware the Tall Grass. What can you share with us about this book?
Oh gosh, I can share that. The way it came, I never intended to write a novel. I was sitting in a car with my husband on a road trip, and there's a story on NPR about this University of Virginia Medical Center program where they look at young children with past life memories and they attempt to corroborate the kids' memories with news accounts of the day. And so I thought that was so captivating. And more often than not, they can match up facts. The kid will say, I was on this ship on this day, and my best friend Joe died. And they'll find a news account where it's the same ship, the same day, and somebody named Joe died. And I thought, this is a novel idea. I wrote it first as a short story, centering around a mother, a very perfectionist mom whose young son has these weird memories of serving in Vietnam, and it causes all this tension in the marriage. And she thought she was going to be able to give him a perfect childhood, and now she finds he's saddled with memories of war. And I brought it to a workshop, and they said, "Oh, this is a novel." And I thought, well, gosh, I'm in trouble because I don't know how to write one of those. So when I thought about the process of extending this story into a novel length work, the first thing that occurred to me was that I needed a second point of view character. And that point of view character should be a circa 1960 soldier serving in Vietnam. Then the only question that was left for me is what's going to happen and how are these two stories connected, right? And I wrote my way into it. I will say honestly that I wrote my way into figuring out what those stories were and figuring out what that connection was. And I consciously sat down and said, well, what are these characters' greatest desires and what are their challenges going to be? So for the mother, my roadmap for her was all the places she was going to take her son in attempts to get him help, and then what was going to be the end result of that. For the soldier, I decided he grew up in Montana, loved his horse, ended up having to put him down, got very depressed, signed up for the military, ended up falling in love and having to leave his love behind to go into battle. And I picked a specific battle. And then I picked a nonfiction work that really detailed the battle. And I used that to help me figure out where he would be on the ground. And then, I wrote Eve the mother, Thomas the soldier in alternate chapters the whole way through, attempting in each chapter to have echoes between the two sides, but also to create challenges for them that would push against their character, that would bring them to the brink over and over again to try to make it sufficiently dramatic. And so, that's how I figured that out. And it only took 8 years. So,
Only yeah, again, and more evidence of an overnight success.
right, right.
Um, so many things fascinate me about this. The first thing I just want to call out is just the author's superpower in my mind is curiosity. So I'm sure there were thousands of people who heard that same story. I think
Yeah,
you mentioned NPR or on the radio, but you took it to it inspired you to like take it to a story idea. And I had a bestseller on here a couple years ago whose hotel maid, she walked in on her hotel maid, just like holding her sweaty pants, like her running clothes, right? And she's like, oh my goodness, this woman knows more about me based on my sweaty running pants than I know about her. And it got her thinking about this character who's a hotel maid, and she like wrote the prologue of her book on a napkin on the airplane on the way home. So I think
wow,
authors have that as a superpower. Like, we don't necessarily let little things go. We plant them in our brains, we water them, and then we give them a little sunshine, and a little bit more irrigation, and off they go. I'm really curious though about your take on past life memories and kids though, because I'm sure you had to do some work on this, and I have thoughts on it, but I'm curious as to what your take is.
I'm not entirely sure that I'm a true believer when it comes to that, but I want to sort of, keep an open mind as much as I can. I mean, all kinds of things are possible. When I think about my own family history, like my family has a weird strain of like gamblers and people who think they're going to hit it big. So my great great grandfather would go into the woods of Canada and prospect for gold. He would leave the family home in the cold and walk around looking for gold. My own father went to the racetrack and attempted to hit it big on the horses. I myself, my hobby is entering contests, and I've entered and won lots of contests and won trips places and crazy stuff. So clearly we have this sort of dreamy strain of like we're going to hit it big or whatever. So I do think, so what do we carry or what do we pass down that's sort of minute or strange, or and then this question of memory. What happens with these kids is they have these vivid memories until about the time that they start to form their own, and then it all kind of fades away. So I mean, I'm willing to believe that this is certainly true for some people. And since going on book tour, I've heard more stories from folks. A guy I sat with at the Louisville Book Festival said that his son, they were in a car, and his son pointed out, he said, that's the factory where I worked and where I crashed my red truck and died, when I crashed my red truck and died.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, to believe in this stuff, you have to, if you grew up in a sort of a religious structure or even a non-religious structure where past lives aren't a thing, right? And I think this is true for both people who are probably religious and not religious, because if you're from a certain religious background, you believe this is it, this is your one chance around, and you die, and maybe you're judged, but you're not here anymore and you don't come back. And then like on the non-religious side of things, it's you die and you're gone because there's no coming back. There's no other place. So
right.
to say that, oh, maybe there is this like reincarnation thing, really challenges a lot of, especially in the West, right? A lot of
Mhm.
our Western conventions. So it is kind of a little bit hard for a lot of us to take, but I listen to a lot of these like woo woo shows,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
where they talk about people who have past lives and people who have past life memories. I've even heard interviews with people who have pre-birth memories, which to me that's like really out there, right? Because if
yeah.
you have pre-birth memories, like, oh, okay, that opens up a whole new can of worms for a lot of people. But so I don't know what to make of it myself, but I love the premise, right? I love your premise that you started with.
Well, thanks. And and here's the thing I did for myself as a writer. I said, my only obligation is to depict these characters' journey through this situation. I don't necessarily have to explain it, but I have to show you how they come to understand how it functions. So that took a lot of heat off, because if I thought I had to really explain it in a major way or come down on one side or the other, that was going to be a lot of pressure. But by the end of the book, you understand how Charlie, Eve's son, and Thomas are inextricably connected. And you really understand Eve's thoughts on what all that means and why it happens.
Yeah. But to
Yeah.
me, it's fascinating. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. I know we can't talk too much more about it because obviously we don't want to give any spoilers away. Hopefully, we whet the appetite of our listeners to want to go out and buy it. But one thing I want to go back to is you saying that this was really, when you're workshopping it, somebody says, no, it's not a short story, really is a novel, and now this is, I've never done one of these before. How did you sort of overcome that? I know we talked a little bit more. We talked in the beginning about fear of being bad at something, but how did you go from thinking, okay, short story, now it's a novel, having never written a novel before? How did you sort of get over your perceived limitations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I picked up this idea of this compelling second point of view character, and I started to write. I wrote in really short sections. In fact, at first, my sections were so short that a member of my writers group said, "You've got to combine them because they don't even seem like chapters." And she was totally 100% right. So, and then I wrote it in a way that intrigued me, which is I'd write an Eve section, then a Thomas section. So I was going back and forth between the two the whole way as I built the story. And as I was doing it, I noticed that there could be unconscious echoes between the two sections in the story. And that captivated me even more. And then I was like, well, and when I don't see those echoes, I'm going to create them. So to give a kind of a benign example that won't give away a plot point, there's a quiet, every novel needs like a moment of quiet. And there's a moment of quiet where Eve's at home, the dishwasher's running, Charlie hasn't had any nightmares recently, and she's thinking, okay, maybe peace, right? And Thomas is in Vietnam on night watch, and it's a beautiful night, and he crawls out of his foxhole, walks to the edge of this forest and sees a deer and feeds this deer peanuts, and it's this moment of peace for him. So again, I just got captivated with the doing of it and trying to find these parallel structures, and I did it in short enough sections so that I didn't freak out, and then I created a kind of a narrative roadmap for each. And it was just, I didn't have a big chart. I had maybe a piece of paper that said they go here, then they go here, then they go here. So every time I felt unsteady, I could look at that and say, hey, I know where we're going next. Right. And that helped me a lot. So,
Yeah, that takes some of the anxiety away. Not
yeah,
saying you fully plotted it out or it was handcuffs for you, but if you know where it's going, then you can almost take a little step back and say, okay, well, I know where this is going to go. I know where this is going to wind up anyway.
right.
Then you just have to worry a little bit about how you're inching them down the road. And I love that notion of that those two parallels there of sort of like a little peace and quiet because the readers do need a little downtime in whatever story, whether it's a comedy or a drama, you need to give them a little bit of a break from the emotion. So
Absolutely.
I think
Yeah.
that's really cool. Now, if you really wanted to get heady, you could do like you could believe that time is nonlinear and both these timelines are actually happening at the same time. But now we're getting into the Marvel multiverse type thing,
I
and
like it.
it's a little that might blow people's minds away too much. But I imagine it must have been fun writing present day, but also writing in from the point of view of like 1968, because so much. I mean, talk about a cultural revolution that was going on in our country back then.
Oh, yeah, and now this character in particular was like a kid who lived in Missoula, Montana on a ranch, so they were kinda insulated from some of that, but I did do a scene at their prom, and so there was the music that was playing and, the stuff that was happening that, and then, of course, there was this question of Vietnam, which he signs up for in part because the recruiter talks about being a part of something bigger, and he so misses the animal that had been his companion, really his constant companion, that he thought, oh yeah, that's what I want to feel connected. But then whoops, then he's off to, and it's a whole different story once he gets there. Um, yeah, so it was fun to write both parts, but particularly that part, and the language, and then just the intensity of war. The thing I love about writing short stories is the intensity, and I was able to write a novel that kind of walked hand in hand with some of that. So.
Yeah, just thinking about that poor horse in Missoula. If my mother were alive, were still alive, and listening to this interview, she would have turned it off after hearing that the horse was put down.
Right.
Because I once wrote a book with a dog, and she says to me, it was a a mystery thriller type thing. She looks at me, quarter of the way in, she's like, "Nothing better happened to that dog, Michael." Um, and of course, well, something happened to the dog, but then she was such an animal lover, and she would always tell me, Michael, on my 16th birthday, all of my friends got cars and I got a horse, which was true. She did get a horse named Kippy,
Wow.
16 and a half hands high. But
Wow.
that's my mother coming through right now.
Love that.
Um,
That was the
I
hard I was gonna say that was the hardest scene to write.
I'm sure I can only
Horrible,
imagine.
horrible to write, and when I read it out at readings, and I do read it because it happens really early, people just weep,
Well,
and I feel so good for having made them cry.
he's sadist.
I
Feels so
know.
good.
Yeah, I
Or
did.
masochist. I don't know.
I
I
love
always
it.
get those two
Yeah.
terms mixed up. I don't
Yeah,
know. Maybe there's a story about that in 35 Women Up to No Good. I'm not sure.
probably.
Um, one way I like to get to know my guests a little bit more is through some pop culture questions. So, Ellen, if you're game, I'm curious. When you were growing up, what were some of your favorite things to watch on TV?
Oh my God. Well, it ran the gamut. I loved like That Girl and Bewitched and all those shows where, these women were trying to sort of find their power, but as a family, we watched Mary Tyler Moore show, which I absolutely adored. And Carol Burnett show. And when I was little, I told people I either wanted to be Carol Burnett or a professional golfer, which I don't know where those far out choices came. Um, so I loved all of that. And then, I would watch TV with my dad. So a lot of Rockford Files, which I've kind of slipped back into here. They run reruns at night, and it's like, I'm
Look,
like, let's do that.
I have Rockford Files, Quincy, and Kojak. I don't know if they're in that order, but
Yeah.
those are three shows that I watch regularly. And I love the theme song to the Rockford Files done
Oh,
by Mike Post, who also did
uh-huh.
Law and Order and a bunch of other shows too.
So good.
Um,
Yeah.
so all good answers there. How about music? What'd you like listening to?
Oh gosh, my parents they were sort of 1960s era hippie-ish people. We had Pete Seeger albums, so we would listen to those. And then I remember listening to ELO with my dad and in the living room, and we're dancing around. And then, of course, my older sister was like the gold standard for what was cool. So she always had whatever album, I remember early Tom Petty, and then I really had a period where I got into classic rock like Led Zeppelin and Neil Young. I'm still a huge Neil Young fan, and so that was a big part of it for me.
Yeah, yeah, all good answers there. But man, Led Zeppelin was something else. Jeez. And I love Neil Young too. He's still kicking it, right? I mean, he's still doing
Gosh,
some interesting stuff.
he really is, and he's developed some kind of recording system or something.
Yeah, he had some
He's
like MP3 player or something that he was hawking not long ago.
kind of a mad genius. He just does his own thing. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And then if you can go back in time and give your younger self some words of advice, what would you tell? Maybe it's the younger girl who's watching, these movies, inappropriate movies at the movie theater with her dad. Like, what would you whisper in your younger self's ear?
I mean, I think I would tell her, just pay attention because all of this is fodder, right? All of this is going to help you figure out what you care about and what you want to write about. And just pay attention to people and how they behave, and, keep your ears open. And I think that would mainly be it.
Very cool. Well, Ellen, I'm sure we've intrigued some people about you. Where can people learn more about you? Do you have a website or some social media profiles that you're active
Yeah,
on?
absolutely. So it's ellenbirkettmorris.com. And then, I have a Facebook writers page and a personal page. Ellen Birkett Morris Writer is the writers page. I'm on Instagram and also on Blue Sky and on Threads. And so it would all be Ellen Birkett Morris. That's where you can find me.
All
So,
right. I'll put all those links in our show notes so people can easily find you, Ellen. I want to say thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.